The door opened before Eleanor could compose herself. She was standing too close to the desk, one glove half removed, her hair coming loose from its pins where she'd pressed her palm to her temple moments ago, willing the dizziness to pass. Duke Hastings stood 3 feet away, his hand still raised from where he'd just caught her elbow to steady her. That was all. That was everything. The candlelight made it look like more. "Oh," Lady Pembroke's voice carried from the doorway, bright with delight she didn't bother disguising. Behind her, 2 more guests crowded to see Mrs. Aldridge, fan already fluttering. Young Lord Caro, eyes wide with the particular glee of a man handed a story he'll tell for weeks. Eleanor stepped back from Hastings so quickly she nearly stumbled. "This isn't," her voice cracked. She hated that it cracked. "I felt faint. His Grace only." "Of course." Mrs. Aldridge's smile said the opposite of course. Hastings hadn't moved. His jaw had gone tight, a single muscle ticking beneath the surface calm, his grey eyes fixed not on the witnesses but on Eleanor, assessing, calculating, already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. "You should not have come down this corridor," he said. Quiet. Not to her, to them. We heard a sound. Lord Caro's grin widened, like something falling. "Like someone falling into someone's arms," the grin said, and everyone in the room heard it. Eleanor's hands curled into her skirts to keep them from shaking. Her father's name, her father's debts. A scandal like this wouldn't ruin her alone, it would finish what his creditors had already started. "There is nothing here to discuss," Hastings said. "Of course not, Your Grace." Lady Pembroke's eyes glittered with the particular cruelty of a woman who has already chosen her opening line for tomorrow's tea. "We'll leave you both to recover." She did not move. None of them moved. They were waiting, Eleanor understood with a sick, plummeting clarity, for him to do something. Say something. Give them the ending their story required. Hastings's gloved hand closed slowly at his side. When he spoke, he did not look at Eleanor at all. "She will be my wife by week's end." The room went silent enough that Eleanor heard her own pulse. Eleanor's father did not look up from his glass when the Duke's carriage was announced. "Tell him I'm not receiving," Sir Whitmore muttered, though they both knew that wasn't a choice either of them had anymore. Eleanor showed Hastings into the drawing room herself. The fire had been lit too late and barely warmed the air. She was grateful for the excuse to keep her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders, grateful for anything that gave her hands something to hold besides themselves. Hastings did not sit. He stood near the window, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, surveying the threadbare curtains and the faint damp stain near the ceiling with an expression that gave away nothing and that, somehow, was worse than if he'd shown contempt outright. "I assume you understand why I've come," he said. "I assume you'll tell me regardless of what I understand." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite surprise, not quite approval. Gone before she could name it. By tomorrow evening, the story will have reached every household worth mentioning. His voice was even, businesslike, a man reading terms of a contract rather than discussing a woman's ruin. "Your reputation will not survive it, nor, frankly, will mine, though I find I mind that considerably less. How fortunate for you to have so little to lose." "I didn't say I had nothing to lose," he turned from the window. "I said I minded it less. There's a difference, Miss Whitmore, though I don't expect you to care about it tonight." She held his gaze longer than was comfortable for either of them. "And your solution is marriage." "My solution is correction." He said it without flinching, as though the word cost him nothing, though she noted, with the close attention she'd learned to pay to men who held power over her, that his hand had tightened slightly against his own sleeve. "A scandal requires an ending society can accept. A wedding is the only ending available to us that doesn't end your life as thoroughly as it ends my evening's inconvenience. How romantic. I'm not offering romance. For the first time, something sharpened in his voice, not cruelty, but a kind of warning, as though she'd stepped closer to him than the conversation allowed. I'm offering you a name that will protect you, a household that will not starve, and a husband who will not trouble you with expectations you haven't agreed to. That is more than most women in your position are offered. And what would you know of my position? The question landed harder than she'd intended. She saw it reach him, a brief stillness in his jaw, there, and erased almost too quickly to trust she'd seen it at all. I know your father owes considerably more than this house is worth, he said, quiet now. I know the man he owes it to, and I know precisely why you were standing in that corridor tonight, Miss Whitmore, though you have not once tried to explain it to me. Eleanor's breath caught. You knew, she said slowly, before tonight. You knew this was being arranged against you. I suspected. His grey eyes held hers, steady, unreadable. I did not know it would be you. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Somewhere down the hall, her father's glass clinked against the decanter, refilling. If I marry you, Eleanor said carefully, I will not do it as a debt to be managed. I have terms of my own, Your Grace, and I suspect you will not like them. For the first time since he'd entered the room, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something colder and far more interested. Tell me, he said, what a woman with nothing believes she's in a position to demand. I will not pretend to love you. She said it plainly, without flourish, watching for the reaction she expected, offense, perhaps, or that same cold amusement he wore like armor. Instead, his expression simply waited, unmoved, as though she'd stated the weather. Go on. And I will not perform gratitude for being rescued from a trap I did not set. Eleanor's voice held steady, though her pulse had not. I will not curtsy lower than required, smile wider than I feel, or pretend in front of your friends that I am the fortunate one in this arrangement. And in front of my enemies? Especially in front of your enemies. A flicker of something dangerously close to satisfaction crossed her face. They orchestrated this to humiliate us both. I won't hand them the satisfaction of watching me grovel for a marriage I didn't ask for. Hastings studied her with the particular stillness of a man recalculating an opponent he'd underestimated. Anything else? Separate rooms? She lifted her chin slightly, daring him to object. I will not share a bed out of obligation, Your Grace. If that ever changes, it will be because I chose it, not because a contract demanded it. Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger. Closer to respect, though guarded so carefully she almost missed it. Agreed, he said too quickly for her to trust it came without cost. And an allowance of my own, not pin money doled out from my obedience funds I control, to send to my father as I see fit, without requiring your permission each time. You're negotiating like a man settling a debt of honor. I am settling a debt of honor. Mine, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed the only tremor she allowed herself. I did not choose this marriage, Your Grace, but I refuse to enter it as something to be managed, housed, and forgotten in a wing of your estate. If I am to be your Duchess, I will be one, in fact, not merely in name pinned to a scandal you needed silenced. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd finally pushed past whatever line he'd drawn for himself. When he spoke, his voice had dropped quieter, rougher at the edges, as though something in him had loosened without his permission. You assume I intended to forget you, didn't you? He didn't answer immediately. He crossed toward her instead, slow, deliberate, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her face upward to hold his gaze close enough, that she caught the faint scent of cedar and rain still clinging to his coat from the carriage ride over. "I intended," he said, low, "to marry you the way I signed treaties, efficiently, without complication." His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite every instinct telling her not to let it. "You are already complicating it." Eleanor refused to step back. "Is that a warning, Your Grace?" "It's an observation." His gaze dropped, briefly, to where her hands had tightened in her lap, and for one unguarded second, something almost gentle crossed his face before he caught it and put it away. "One I find I don't entirely dislike." He straightened, putting careful distance between them once more. The moment sealed shut as quickly as it had opened. "Your terms are accepted," he said, voice returning to its measured calm. "All but one." Eleanor's chin lifted. "Which one?" "The wedding will not be small, and it will not be quiet." His eyes held hers, unreadable once more. "Whoever arranged tonight's humiliation wanted us hidden in shame, Miss Whitmore. I intend to marry you in front of every person who hoped to watch us fall." She opened her mouth to argue and stopped, because for the first time since the candle had burned low in that cursed study, she understood she was no longer looking at a man managing a scandal. She was looking at a man already planning a war. The church had been full. Every seat, every whisper accounted for, every rival's face arranged into the careful smile of someone pretending they hadn't hoped for the opposite outcome. Eleanor had walked the aisle with her chin level and her hands steady, and if anyone had searched her face for shame, they'd found nothing to feed on. Now the house was quiet, and the silence felt entirely different. She sat at the dressing table in the room that was, by her own negotiated terms, hers alone gown exchanged for a dressing robe, hair loosed from its pins, the weight of the day finally settling into her shoulders. She hadn't expected him to knock. "Come in." Hastings entered slowly, already without his coat, his cravat loosened at the throat in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like a man who'd spent the evening fighting a battle no one else had noticed. He stopped a few feet inside the door, as though some invisible line existed there that he wasn't certain he had the right to cross. "I didn't come to claim anything. I came to see that you'd settled." "I've settled." She turned on the small bench to face him, hands folded in her lap. "Though I confess, I expected a maid to confirm it, rather than you yourself. I find I don't trust other people's reports of you." A faint, rare, almost smile touched his mouth before vanishing. "You have a talent for appearing composed when you are not, and you have a talent for appearing unaffected when you are not." Her gaze held his, deliberate. "We are well matched in our deceptions, Your Grace." Something in his expression sharpened not offense. Recognition. He crossed the room without seeming to decide to, stopping close enough that the candlelight carved every line of restraint along his jaw into sharp relief. His hands stayed at his sides, gloved still, though his fingers had curled slightly, as though resisting their own instinct. "Today, you married a man half of London believes incapable of feeling anything at all." A pause waited. "I'd like to know what you believe." The unexpected nakedness of the question caught her breath before she could stop it. "I believe you stood in front of everyone who orchestrated our ruin and made certain they watched you choose me anyway." Her eyes didn't waver from his. "That isn't the action of a man who feels nothing. It might have been strategy. It might have been, still steady, but strategy doesn't explain why you're standing 3 feet away from me right now instead of already walking back out that door." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it charged, taut, neither of them retreating from it, though every rule they'd built the marriage on demanded they should. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and began removing one glove finger by finger, unhurried, his eyes never leaving hers. The gesture, should have meant nothing. It felt like the loudest thing either of them had done all day. I made you a promise in that drawing room. No expectations beyond what you agreed to. You did. I intend to keep it. His bared hand hovered near her cheek, close enough that she felt the warmth of him without the contact itself, restraint stretched to its very last thread. Tonight, and every night, until you tell me otherwise. Her pulse beat loud enough to hear in the quiet between them. And if I never tell you otherwise? His jaw tightened. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite pain, not quite hope. A man already bracing for a loss he hadn't suffered yet. Then I will spend the rest of my life, low now, almost rough, exactly 3 feet away from you. He withdrew his hand before it ever touched her skin, stepped back, and reached the door before she found her voice again. Duke Hastings. He paused, hand on the frame, not yet turning. That note, the one that brought me to that corridor, careful, deliberate. Have you learned yet who sent it? His shoulders went rigid. The silence that followed lasted long enough to answer the question before he did. I have a name. Cold, now. In a register she hadn't heard from him before, not the coldness of control, but the coldness of a man glimpsing the shape of a war still waiting to be fought. I am not yet certain it's the right one. He left before she could ask anything more, and Eleanor sat alone in the candlelight, understanding with a slow, sinking certainty that whatever had begun in that study 3 nights ago had not ended at all. The estate ran on a rhythm. Eleanor learned the way she'd learned everything else in her life by watching closely and saying little. Breakfast was taken separately. He rose before dawn and was already gone by the time she came down. Dinner was the only meal they shared, conducted with the strained politeness of 2 diplomats observing a truce neither fully trusted. Servants moved through the halls with the practiced silence of people accustomed to a household built on distance. She had asked for separate rooms. She had not asked for separate lives entirely, and yet that was what she'd received, and some nights, alone in the dark, she resented how easily he'd granted it. You've barely touched your plate. His voice startled her on the 3rd evening, the first time he'd commented on anything beyond the weather since the wedding. I wasn't aware you were watching. She set down her fork with deliberate calm. I notice things. His grey eyes lifted from his own plate, steady, assessing. It's a habit I've never managed to break. And what have you noticed? That you write to your father every Tuesday and burn half the letters that come back without finishing them. A pause, careful. That you've rearranged the library twice since arriving, though no one asked you to. That you flinch, very slightly, when a door closes too hard, though you'd never admit it. Her spine went rigid. You've been having me watched. I've been paying attention. Something almost wounded crossed his face before he masked it. There's a difference, though I understand why you wouldn't trust it yet. She studied him across the candlelit table, searching for the calculation she expected and finding, instead, something that looked uncomfortably like sincerity. Why do you care what I do with my father's letters? His jaw tightened the tell she'd already begun cataloguing, the one place his control slipped before he caught it. Because I imagine it isn't easy, loving a man who's cost you this much. The words landed somewhere she hadn't braced for. She looked down at her plate rather than let him see what crossed her face. He's still my father. I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm only saying, I noticed. Silence settled between them, not the brittle kind they'd grown accustomed to, but something softer, more dangerous for being so. A knock at the dining room door broke it. The butler entered with the particular stiffness of a man delivering news he already suspected wouldn't be welcome. Your Grace, a letter has arrived. The messenger insisted it required your immediate attention. Hastings took the envelope without rising, though Eleanor caught the shift behind his eyes the moment he registered the seal pressed into the wax. She didn't recognize the crest, but she recognized instantly the way his entire posture changed, shoulders set, jaw locked, every trace of softness from a moment ago vanishing as though it had never existed at all. "Leave us." When they were alone again, her voice stayed deliberately even. "Who is it from?" He turned the envelope once in his hands, studying the seal as though it might rearrange itself into something less dangerous if he looked at it long enough. "Lord Ashworth." A beat, too long. "Requesting the pleasure of our company at his estate next month." Her breath went still. "The man who orchestrated the night that ruined us, yes." His knuckles had gone white around the envelope's edge, and now, apparently, wishes to celebrate our marriage. He set the letter down with a control so precise, it was more frightening than if he'd crushed it outright. "We will, of course, quiet, final, be attending." The fever broke Eleanor's composure before it broke her fever. It started as a chill she dismissed, then a heaviness in her limbs she blamed on a poor night's sleep, and by the third evening she could no longer rise from bed without the room tilting sideways. She told no one. She had spent too many years learning that illness, in a house with no money to spare, was a private inconvenience to be managed alone. She underestimated how closely he'd been watching. "You missed dinner." His voice came from the doorway of her room, a doorway he had never once crossed since the wedding night. The 3 feet of distance he'd promised her preserved, with a discipline she'd almost come to resent. "I wasn't hungry." Her own voice came out thinner than she intended, frayed at the edges. He crossed the room before she finished the sentence. His hand found her forehead with none of the practiced reserve he wore like a second skin bare hand, gloves already discarded somewhere between the doorway and the bed, as though the formality of removing them properly hadn't survived the sight of her this pale. "You're burning." Low, sharper than she'd ever heard him. "How long has this been happening?" 3 days. She tried to sit up. His hand shifted from her forehead to her shoulder, firm enough to still her without hurting. 3 days, and you said nothing. "It's a fever, Your Grace, not a battlefield injury. It is whatever I decide it is, in my own house." The words came out harder than he likely intended. She watched him hear it too, watched something flicker behind his eyes as he reined the sharpness back in. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, rougher, stripped of its usual control. "Forgive me, I don't." He stopped, started again. "I don't manage this particular fear well." "Fear?" The word slipped out before she could stop it, disbelieving. His jaw worked once, twice, the muscle there betraying him the way it always did. He didn't answer. Instead, he rose, crossed to the bell pull, summoned the housekeeper with 3 short words, and returned to sit at the edge of her bed, a position so far outside the boundaries they'd built that she felt the wrongness of it like a held breath. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I'm aware." He didn't move. His hand found hers where it lay against the coverlet, not gripping, simply resting there, his thumb tracing one slow, absent line across her knuckles as though he hadn't fully decided to do it himself. "I find I'd rather not be anywhere else tonight." Eleanor's breath caught, not from the fever this time. "That's not the arrangement we made." "No." His eyes lifted to hers, steady despite everything else about him that wasn't. "It isn't." He didn't withdraw his hand. He didn't explain himself further. He simply sat there in the candlelight, watching over her with the quiet, devastating attentiveness of a man who had spent his whole life believing he didn't need anyone and was only now discovering how badly he'd been lying to himself. The housekeeper's knock startled them both. Eleanor watched him straighten instantly, the mask sliding back into place with practiced speed, his hand withdrawing from hers a half-second too slow to look entirely accidental. "See that the Duchess has whatever the physician recommends." he said to the housekeeper, voice perfectly level once more. Tonight, not in the morning. Of course, Your Grace. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. The same pause from the night Ashworth's letter arrived, the same stillness of a man weighing whether to say more than he'd intended to. Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her name without the title attached to it. The physician will ask what brought this on. His voice had gone careful again, edged with something she couldn't quite place. I'd like to know the same thing, and I don't believe it's only a chill. She said nothing. The truth that she'd been too proud to admit how alone she felt in a house full of servants and a husband 3 feet away at every meal wasn't one she was ready to hand him. His eyes held hers a moment longer, searching for the answer she wouldn't give. We'll discuss it, he said quietly, when you're well enough to lie to me convincingly again. He left before she could decide whether that had been a threat or the closest thing to tenderness he knew how to offer. She had not expected to dance. The invitation to Lady Carrington's ball had arrived weeks before the fever, before Ashworth's letter, before any of it. A routine obligation. Neither of them could decline without inviting precisely the kind of speculation they'd spent a marriage trying to outrun. Eleanor had recovered enough to attend, though Hastings had watched her dress that evening with a wariness he hadn't bothered disguising. You don't have to prove anything tonight, he said, in the carriage, his eyes on the passing dark rather than on her. I'm not trying to prove anything. She adjusted one glove, steady despite the flutter beneath her ribs. I'm trying to survive an evening in a room full of people who'd prefer I hadn't. He said nothing to that, but his hand, resting on the seat between them, shifted half an inch closer to hers, close enough that she felt the warmth of it, without either of them closing the remaining distance. The ballroom was exactly as cruel as she'd anticipated. Eyes followed her across the floor. Conversations dimmed and resumed in her wake, and more than once she caught Lady Pembroke's smile sharpen with the particular satisfaction of a woman still waiting for the marriage to fail, spectacularly enough to justify her original gossip. It was Lord Carrow who approached first. Duchess. His bow was a touch too low, his smile a touch too familiar. I confess I'm relieved to see you looking so well. London worried, after the ceremony, that His Grace might keep you locked away entirely. London worries about a great many things that aren't its concern, my lord. His smile widened, undeterred. May I have this dance? She felt Hastings's attention before she saw it, a stillness settling over him from several feet away, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the room. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the exact moment his jaw tightened, the exact moment his hand curled at his side. Of course, she said, and let Carrow lead her onto the floor. She felt Hastings's eyes on her for the entire dance, not glancing, not subtle. A fixed and unrelenting attention that several onlookers noticed before she did. Carrow noticed it too, his smile faltering slightly each time he turned her and caught sight of the Duke standing motionless at the edge of the floor. Your husband doesn't appear to be enjoying this, Carrow murmured, amused. My husband enjoys very little in public, my lord. I wouldn't read too much into it. But she didn't entirely believe that herself, not with the way the air seemed to thin every time the dance brought her back into his line of sight. When the music ended, Hastings was already crossing the floor before she'd finished her curtsy to Carrow. Duchess. His voice was even. His eyes were not. I believe the next dance is mine. It wasn't a request. Carrow, sensing the temperature of the room shift, bowed and retreated with considerably more haste than he'd arrived. Hastings's hand found hers, and this time there was no half-inch of careful distance. His fingers closed around hers fully, deliberately, his other hand settling at her waist with a pressure that was less about the steps of the dance and more about something he didn't seem inclined to name. You held my gaze through the entire dance, she said quietly, as they moved through the first turn. Half the room noticed. I'm aware. That wasn't part of our arrangement. No. His grip at her waist tightened fractionally, not painful, just present, undeniable. It wasn't. Then why? His eyes dropped to hers, and for a moment, the careful control he wore like armor slipped entirely, replaced by something raw, almost startled at its own intensity, as though he hadn't intended to let her see it at all. Because, for the length of that dance, he said, voice low enough that only she could hear it, I watched another man's hands on you, and I discovered I am not nearly as indifferent to that as I promised you I'd be. The music swelled around them. Eleanor's breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. Your Grace. Don't. His hand at her waist drew her fractionally closer, the distance between their bodies thinning to something that made the room's eyes sharpen with renewed interest. Not tonight. Tonight, simply dance with me, Eleanor. Let the rest of London draw whatever conclusions they like. She should have stepped back. She should have reminded him of every rule they'd built this marriage on. Instead, she let her hand tighten slightly in his, and across the ballroom, in the shadow of a marble column, Lord Ashworth watched the two of them with a smile that held nothing celebratory in it at all. The library had become her refuge. In the weeks since the ballroom, the one room in the estate that felt entirely her own, rearranged twice over with the books she loved closest to the fire. She hadn't expected him to find her there past midnight, still awake, a single candle burning low beside an unread page. You're not sleeping. She closed the book without marking her place. Neither are you, apparently. He crossed to the window rather than the chair across from her. His hands clasped behind his back in the posture she'd learned meant he was working through something he hadn't decided whether to say aloud. Ashworth's invitation, he said finally. We leave for his estate in 3 days. I haven't forgotten. I have reason to believe, careful now, each word weighed before it left him, that the invitation isn't a peace offering. I believe he intends to use the visit to finish what he started in that study. Eleanor set the book aside entirely. Finish it how? I don't know yet. His jaw tightened, the muscle there betraying the calm he was working hard to maintain, which is precisely what concerns me. She rose from her chair, crossing the room until she stood near enough to see the tension drawn tight across his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man bracing for a blow he couldn't yet see coming. Then we don't go. Refusing would confirm to every drawing room in London that we have something to fear. He turned to face her. Ta. And the candlelight caught the strain beneath his composure, something rawer than she'd seen from him even the night of her fever. I cannot protect you from speculation, Eleanor. I never could. I can only decide how we walk into the room they've prepared for us. You keep saying protect. She studied him carefully, as though that's the only thing standing between us and whatever Ashworth intends. Isn't it? I don't think it is. Her voice softened, though she didn't retreat. I think you've decided protecting me is easier than admitting why it matters so much that you do. Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger. Something far more dangerous to the careful order he'd built his entire life around. He reached up and began removing his gloves, slowly, one finger at a time, the same unhurried ritual she'd come to recognize as the only outward sign that something in him had cracked past the point of hiding it. He set them on the table between them with a deliberate finality, as though laying down a weapon he no longer trusted himself to hold. I married you to end a scandal, he said, voice low, stripped of every careful edge he usually kept it sharpened with. That was the truth. The night I said the words in front of Pembroke and Carow and every other vulture circling for the story, I told myself it would remain a transaction, efficient, contained. And now I find myself standing in my own library at midnight. His eyes didn't leave hers. Raw, in a way that made her chest ache. Unable to recall the last hour I didn't spend thinking about you. I watch you across a dinner table and forget what I meant to say. I dance with you once and discover I am capable of jealousy I didn't believe myself built for. I sat at your bedside during a fever and understood, for the first time in my life, what it might cost me to lose something I swore I'd never let myself want. Eleanor's breath had gone shallow, every careful boundary she'd built suddenly fragile beneath the weight of what he was handing her. That is not a transaction, Your Grace. No. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate, and finally came to rest against her cheek, bare skin against bare skin. The 3 feet of distance he'd sworn to keep collapsed entirely into nothing. It isn't. She didn't pull away. She felt the tremor in his hand, the restraint it cost him to touch her this gently when everything else about him strained toward something far less careful. Eleanor, her name again, without the title, the way he'd said it the night of her fever, except this time there was nothing careful left in how he said it. Tell me to stop, and I will. I'll put the gloves back on. I'll keep the distance you asked for. I'll go back to pretending this is only ever what we agreed it would be. She lifted her hand and covered his, where it rested against her cheek, not pulling it away, holding it there. Don't stop, she said quietly. The candle guttered low between them as he closed the last of the distance, and outside the library window, unseen by either of them, a rider departed the estate grounds at speed, carrying word of everything Ashworth needed to know, straight back to the one place neither of them wanted it to go. Ashworth's estate rose out of the winter fog like something built to intimidate rather than welcome. Grey stone, black iron gates, windows lit gold against a sky already darkening by mid-afternoon. Eleanor felt the change in Hastings the moment the carriage passed through the gates. His hand found hers without announcement, fingers lacing through hers with a grip that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with bracing. Whatever happens tonight, he said, low, eyes fixed on the approaching house, stay close to me. I intend to. Ashworth received them himself at the door, tall, silver-templed, a smile arranged with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed it. Your Grace, Duchess, how good of you to finally accept one of my invitations. How good of you to finally send one we couldn't decline, Hastings said evenly. Ashworth's smile didn't waver. Come in, come in. I've gathered a small party, old friends, mostly. I thought it past time. Everyone saw how well marriage suits you both. The drawing room he led them into was already half full, familiar faces from the ballroom, from the wedding, from the night in that fateful study. Lady Pembroke's eyes found Eleanor's instantly, bright with anticipation. Mrs. Aldridge's fan paused, mid-motion. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze settle on her like a held breath, waiting to be released. Duchess. Ashworth's voice carried, deliberately pitched for the room. I confess, I've long wondered about the particulars of that evening that brought you and His Grace together. Such an unusual courtship. There was no courtship, my lord. There was a scandal you arranged. Eleanor kept her voice level, refusing the bait laid plainly in front of her. I'd think you'd remember the details better than anyone in this room. A ripple moved through the gathered guests. Surprise, delight, the particular hunger of an audience, sensing blood in the water. Ashworth's smile thinned at the edges. A bold accusation, Duchess. Have you proof of it? I have a forged note. Hastings's voice cut in, quiet and absolutely controlled, his hand tightening fractionally around Eleanor's. Written in a hand I've since confirmed belongs to your own secretary. Delivered to my wife under the pretense of my aunt's illness, an illness that, as it happens, never occurred. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A serious claim, Ashworth said, recovering quickly, though Eleanor caught the flicker of something uneasy beneath his composure. Made without witnesses. Made with a confession. Hastings reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, holding it without yet offering it. Your secretary proved considerably less loyal once I offered him a choice between honesty and unemployment. Gasps moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. Lady Pembroke's fan had stopped entirely. Ashworth's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack in his composure since they'd arrived. You wouldn't dare make accusations of this nature in my own home, in front of— I would, and I have. Hastings's voice never rose, never lost its terrible calm, and Eleanor understood, watching him, that this was the version of him she'd glimpsed only in fragments until now, not cold, not detached, but lethally precise. Every word a blade he'd been sharpening since the night this began. You orchestrated a scandal to destroy my reputation and ruin an innocent woman's name out of a grievance you've nursed for years. I've spent every week of this marriage gathering exactly the proof necessary to make certain that when I finally said so publicly, in front of everyone you invited to witness my supposed humiliation, there would be nothing left for you to deny. Ashworth's eyes moved across the room, gauging the damage already visible on every watching face. This is slander. This is consequence. Hastings finally extended the letter toward him, though every eye in the room had already read enough in his expression to know what it contained. You wanted an audience, my lord. You have one. Eleanor felt the room shift entirely, the same eyes that had hunted for her humiliation now turning hungrily toward Ashworth instead. Lady Pembroke's expression had transformed from delight to something far more calculating. She would not, Eleanor understood instantly, be repeating Ashworth's version of events in tomorrow's drawing rooms. But it was Ashworth's hand trembling faintly as he took the letter that told her the war wasn't finished yet. You think this ends it, he said quietly. For her and Hastings alone, his public smile gone entirely. You think a confession from a frightened secretary undoes years of careful work. I think, Hastings said, voice dropping to match his, that you've just discovered what it costs to threaten something I've decided I'm not willing to lose. Ashworth's eyes moved to Eleanor, slow, deliberate, a final calculation passing behind them before he spoke his next words. Careful, Your Grace. His voice had gone soft, almost gentle, which made it more unsettling than any threat he might have shouted. I wonder if your Duchess knows the rest of what I discovered about her father's debts and precisely who else they're owed to. Eleanor's breath went still. Hastings's grip on her hand tightened to something just short of pain. And across the room, the door to the drawing room opened to admit one final, uninvited guest, a man Eleanor recognized instantly, and whose presence in that house made every careful victory of the last 5 minutes collapse into something far more dangerous than either of them had prepared for. Her father stood in the doorway, looking smaller than she remembered him, coat threadbare at the cuffs, color drained from a face that had once commanded an entire household before debt hollowed it out. Eleanor. His voice cracked on her name. Papa. She took a step toward him before catching herself, aware of every eye in the room recalibrating around this new and unexpected piece of the evening. What are you doing here? It was Ashworth who answered, his composure fully restored now, savoring the shift in the room's attention away from his own exposure. Sir Whitmore is a guest of mine, Duchess. Has been, in fact, for the better part of a week. We've had a great deal to discuss. Hastings's grip on Eleanor's hand had gone rigid. What have you done? Nothing yet. Ashworth's smile widened, slow and deliberate. I've simply reminded your father-in-law of the precise terms of his debt to me, terms that, as it happens, include a clause regarding his daughter's marriage prospects, signed in considerably more desperate circumstances than tonight's gathering. Sir Whitmore's eyes wouldn't meet his daughter's. Eleanor, I didn't know when I signed it. I didn't understand what he intended. What clause? Eleanor's voice had gone very quiet, very still. Ashworth produced a folded document with the same theatrical patience he'd shown the letter Hastings had presented minutes before. Except this time, the room's hunger turned back toward her, sharp and renewed. A debt of this size required collateral, Duchess. Your father offered the only asset that retained any value, a clause granting me approval rights over any marriage you entered, on pain of immediate and total forfeiture of the estate. A clause your husband's hasty proposal never accounted for, since no one thought to ask my permission before the wedding. The room's silence had teeth in it now. You're suggesting the marriage is invalid. Hastings's voice had dropped to the register. Eleanor now recognized as dangerous, not loud, never loud, but carrying a stillness that promised violence, held carefully in check. I'm suggesting, Ashworth said, that I have grounds to contest it, and grounds, once filed, take time to resolve, time during which your Duchess's reputation and yours would once again become rather public property. His eyes moved to Eleanor with something almost like pity, almost like cruelty, indistinguishable from each other. I imagine London would find a contested marriage even more delicious than a scandalous one. Eleanor felt her father's shame radiating from where he stood, unable to look at her, and beneath it, something colder settling into her chest, the understanding that her own father had handed a weapon to the man who'd already tried to destroy her once. You knew this, she said to her father, quiet, devastating. When I came to you for help after that night in the study, you already knew what you'd signed. I thought I could fix it before it mattered. His voice broke entirely. I thought I had more time. You had a daughter standing in a stranger's study, ruined by a trap you helped build the foundation for, and you said nothing. The room had gone utterly silent, every guest present now witnessing a wound far more private than the one Ashworth had intended to expose. Hastings stepped forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Eleanor, not to silence her, she understood instantly, but to draw Ashworth's attention back toward himself, away from a grief that deserved privacy. This room would never grant it. You will file your contest, he said to Ashworth, voice carrying now, deliberately, for every witness in the room to hear clearly, and I will meet you in whatever court you choose, with whatever proof you imagine you possess. But understand this, my lord, I did not survive your first scheme by being careless. I will not survive your second by being gentle. Is that a threat? Your Grace, it's a promise. Hastings's eyes hadn't left Ashworth's. You attacked my wife to wound me. You've now attacked her father to wound her. I find I have considerably less patience for restraint than I did the night I first agreed to marry her out of duty alone. Something in his voice on that final word made Eleanor's chest tighten alone, spoken like the ending of a sentence he didn't finish, because everyone in the room, including Ashworth, understood exactly what word should have followed it. Ashworth's smile had finally, entirely vanished. Filing takes time, as I said. He folded the document away with hands that weren't quite as steady as before. I suppose we'll see how much patience survives the wait, Your Grace. He turned and left the room without another word, and in the wake of his departure, every guest present began talking at once, the story already reshaping itself in real time into something Eleanor understood would be impossible to control by morning. Her father finally met her eyes. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Not tonight. She couldn't manage more than that. I can't do this tonight. Hastings's hand found the small of her back, steady, grounding, guiding her toward the door before the room's hungry attention could close in further. But as they reached the threshold, a single line from Ashworth's parting words echoed back to her with sudden, sickening clarity. I suppose we'll see how much patience survives the wait. And Eleanor realized, with her hand still trembling in her husband's, that the true danger of the evening hadn't been the document at all. It had been whatever Ashworth still intended to do while they waited for the courts to decide their fate. The invitation to Lady Carrington's second ball of the season arrived with unusual speed after the night at Ashworth's estate, too soon to be coincidence, too pointed to be anything but the next move. In a game, Eleanor now understood, had never truly paused. We could decline, she said, watching Hastings read the card by the fire. We could. He set it down without urgency, though the tightness at his jaw told a different story than his voice. Ashworth would call it confirmation that the clause has rattled us, that we're hiding. Are we? His eyes lifted to hers, steady. No. And I intend to make certain the entire room understands that, whatever it costs me. The ballroom that night carried a different charge than the one she remembered from weeks before, quieter in places, sharper in others, the particular hush of a society that had already heard whispers of a contested marriage and gathered specifically to watch it unravel in person. Ashworth found them within the first hour, flanked by two men Eleanor didn't recognize and didn't need to. Their presence alone announced their purpose. Your Grace, Duchess. His bow was theatre, nothing more. I confess, I expected you might avoid tonight's gathering, given the circumstances. What circumstances would those be, my lord? Hastings's voice carried, deliberately, for the cluster of guests already drifting closer. The matter of your marriage's validity, of course. Ashworth's smile widened, performing for the room now, rather than for them. I'd think a man in your position would prefer discretion to a ballroom audience. I find discretion has done very little to protect my wife from you, my lord. I see no reason to extend it any further. Hastings' hand found Eleanor's, lacing through her fingers, in full view of everyone watching. Say what you came to say. You clearly didn't bring an audience by accident. A ripple of interest moved through the gathered guests, drawing closer still. Ashworth's smile sharpened. Very well. I've come to ask the Duchess directly, since her husband seems so determined to speak for her at every turn, whether she entered this marriage freely, or whether she understood, at the time, that her father's debts had already obligated her future to another man entirely. The room's silence turned electric. Eleanor felt every eye shift toward her, waiting. The same hunger she remembered from the night in that study, now multiplied tenfold by an audience large enough to fill every drawing room in London by morning. She felt Hastings's hand tighten around hers, not pulling her back, not stepping forward to answer for her. Waiting, trusting her to choose her own ground. I entered this marriage, Eleanor said, voice clear enough to carry to the edges of the room. The same night you arranged for me to be discovered in a private study under false pretenses, my lord. I had very little freedom that evening, you ensured that personally. But I have had freedom in every moment since. Her chin lifted. I have stayed in this marriage because I chose to, not because a clause my father signed in desperation requires it. If you intend to contest the legality of the wedding, contest it in a courtroom. Don't dress your scheme up as concern for my welfare in front of people who watched you orchestrate my ruin in the first place. Gasps rippled through the assembled guests, not at her, Eleanor realized with a steadying breath. At him. Ashworth's composure cracked, fast and visible. You'd take her word over mine, all of you? The word of a woman, married under scandal, defending the very man who, I would take her word, Hastings said, voice cutting through the room with a precision Eleanor had only ever seen him use in negotiations he intended to win completely. Because I have spent every day of this marriage learning that my wife does not lie, even when the truth costs her something. I cannot say the same for you, my lord. He turned fully to face the room, abandoning every instinct toward careful restraint he'd built his reputation on. Lord Ashworth orchestrated the scandal that began this marriage in order to ruin my wife's prospects and secure her as his ward through her father's debt. I have a signed confession from his own secretary confirming it. I did not bring it tonight because I hoped to avoid a public reckoning, my lord. I brought it because I assumed, eventually, you would force my hand exactly as you've just done. He withdrew the folded letter from his coat and held it out not to Ashworth, but to Lord Carrington himself, their host, standing pale and startled near the edge of the circle that had formed around them. I'd ask you to read it aloud, my lord, since your home seems to have become tonight's venue of choice for settling this matter publicly. The room had gone utterly silent, every face turned now toward Ashworth rather than Eleanor. Exactly the inversion Hastings had promised himself he'd force. Weeks ago in his study, and exactly what he delivered, without a flicker of the careful detachment he'd once worn like armor. Ashworth's mouth opened, closed, no performance left sharp enough to salvage what was unraveling in real time in front of half of London's most influential families. This isn't finished, he said finally, low, for Hastings alone, though several nearby guests caught it regardless. No, Hastings agreed, quiet and absolutely certain. But it is decided. There's a difference, my lord, and I find I'm no longer interested in pretending otherwise for your comfort. Ashworth turned and left the ballroom without another word, his two companions trailing after him with the particular haste of men suddenly unwilling to be associated with tonight's outcome. The room exhaled as one, and then, slowly, deliberately, Lady Carrington herself crossed the floor to take Eleanor's hand. "Duchess," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I believe the next dance is overdue." Eleanor felt the tide of the room shift entirely, not healed, not undone, but turned, finally, in a direction that no longer required her silence to survive it. It was only later, in the carriage home, that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what he'd done. "You knew that would cost you," she said quietly, standing against a pier in front of half the ton, with no certainty the room would side with us. "I knew." His eyes found hers in the dark, unguarded in a way she still wasn't accustomed to. "I decided I'd rather lose my reputation defending you honestly than keep it by staying silent while you stood there alone." Eleanor's hand found his in the dark, and for the first time since the night in that cursed study, she let herself believe fully, without reservation, that whatever came next, she would not face it without him beside her. The solicitor's chambers smelled of dust and old leather, and Eleanor sat through the entire consultation with her hands folded too tightly in her lap to feel anything but the ache of her own grip. "The clause is legitimate," Mr. Pratt said, not unkindly, sliding the document back across the desk. "Improperly worded in places, which may work in our favor, but legitimate nonetheless. Lord Ashworth has standing to contest the marriage's validity, given the timing of your father's debt agreement." "How long?" Hastings said, "before a ruling?" "Months, Your Grace. Possibly longer, depending on how aggressively he pursues it." Pratt's eyes moved between them, with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "In the meantime, I'm afraid the marriage remains in a state of legal ambiguity. Not invalid, not entirely secure, either." Eleanor felt the word ambiguity settle into her chest like a stone. They didn't speak in the carriage home. Hastings stared out the window with the particular stillness she'd learned meant he was working through several versions of fury and choosing, deliberately, to display none of them. It was only once they'd reached the privacy of his study that he finally broke it. I should have had the marriage contract reviewed more carefully. His voice was low, rough with something that sounded dangerously close to self-recrimination. I was so focused on ending the scandal quickly that I never considered your father's debts might already be entangled with someone capable of using them against us. You couldn't have known. I should have known. He turned from the window, and the candlelight caught the tightness around his eyes. Exhaustion, she realized, layered beneath something far more raw. I promised you protection. I gave you a marriage with a hole in its foundation I never bothered to check. You gave me a name, a home, and a husband who stood in front of a room full of vultures and dismantled the man who tried to ruin me. Eleanor crossed the room, stopping close enough that he had to look at her rather than past her. I don't fault you for a clause my own father signed before either of us knew the other existed. He's threatening to take you from me through paper, Eleanor, through ink and a judge's signature. His jaw worked, the muscle there betraying him completely now. I've spent my whole life believing that control meant safety, that if I managed every variable carefully enough, nothing could be taken from me that I hadn't already decided to risk. His eyes found hers, stripped raw. I never accounted for losing you to something I can't outmaneuver with strategy alone. Then don't outmaneuver it. Her hand found his, lacing through fingers, still faintly trembling with restrained anger. Let the courts take however long they take. Let Ashworth file whatever he intends to file. None of that changes what's already true between us. And what is already true between us? The question hung in the air, more vulnerable than anything he'd asked her since the night in the library. That I am your wife, she said quietly, not because a clause permits it or a court confirms it, but because I chose to stay every single time I could have walked away. The night you offered to keep 3 feet of distance forever. The night of my fever when you sat at my bedside instead of sending a servant. The night you removed your gloves in the library and told me the truth instead of another careful lie. Her hand tightened around his. Ashworth can contest a marriage. He cannot contest that. Something in Hastings's expression cracked entirely, the last vestige of control, finally giving way to something he'd spent his whole life refusing to show anyone. He pulled her against him without warning, without the careful calculation that governed every other touch they'd shared, his arms closing around her with a desperation that had nothing restrained left in it at all. She felt his breath shudder once against her hair, felt the tension finally bleed out of his shoulders beneath her hands. I am terrified, he said into the quiet, voice barely above a whisper, of how much I need you to still be standing here when this is finished. I will be. You can't promise that. No. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hand rising to rest against the side of his face, the way his had once rested against hers in the library. But I can promise I won't be the one who leaves. He closed his eyes briefly, as though her words had cost him something to receive, then leaned down and kissed her slow, unhurried, nothing like the desperate grip of his arms moments before. Every bit of restraint he'd ever shown her poured instead into the deliberate gentleness of it, as though he were finally allowing himself to want something without calculating its cost first. When they finally parted, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing unevenly in the candlelight. There's something else, he said quietly. Something I haven't told you about the secretary's confession. Eleanor stilled. What haven't you told me? His eyes, when they opened, held a weight she hadn't seen there before, not fear of Ashworth. She realized slowly something else entirely. The note that lured you to that study, he said, wasn't only written at Ashworth's instruction, a pause, heavier than any silence between them yet. It was written using information someone inside this household provided him, someone who knew exactly which night I'd be alone in that wing, and exactly which lie would bring you there. Eleanor's blood went cold. Someone in your own household betrayed you. Someone in our household, he corrected quietly, is still here, and I don't yet know who. The invitations stopped arriving within the week. Not all of them, but enough that Eleanor noticed the thinning correspondence on the silver tray each morning. Enough that she understood exactly what Hastings had traded for the room's silence the night he'd handed Lord Carrington that letter. A peer did not publicly accuse another peer of fraud and walk away unscathed, regardless of how true the accusation proved. Society punished disruption as readily as it punished scandal, sometimes more so. "You've lost 3 boards," she said, finding him in his study surrounded by correspondence he'd been reading with the particular stillness of a man absorbing bad news without letting it show. 4. He didn't look up. Lord Grayson's resignation arrived this morning. Polite, regretful, entirely final. "Because of what you said about Ashworth? Because I made an enemy of a peer in front of the very people whose good opinion keeps men like Grayson comfortable." He set the letter down, finally meeting her eyes. "Ashworth has spent decades cultivating relationships I never bothered to cultivate myself, certain my title alone would always be sufficient. I'm discovering now how wrong I was." Eleanor crossed the room, stopping at the edge of his desk. "Do you regret it?" He was quiet, long enough that she almost feared the answer. "No." The word came without hesitation, low and certain. "I regret that it costs you anything at all, that my reputation's damage might still touch yours, regardless of what I intended. But I do not regret choosing, in front of everyone, to defend you rather than my own comfort." His eyes held hers, steady. "I spent my entire life believing control was the only thing standing between me and ruin. I find I'd rather risk ruin honestly than keep control by lying to everyone, including myself. And even if it costs you everything you've built, I've already decided," he said quietly, "that you are not a cost I am willing to weigh against anything else." She came around the desk without announcing the intention, and he turned his chair to meet her, his hands finding her waist as she settled close. The formality between them finally, entirely dissolved. "There will be more letters," she said. "More boards resigning. More doors closing. Let them close." His thumb traced a slow line along her hip, absent, deliberate. "I find I have far less interest in rooms that require my silence to remain comfortable." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, and both recognized immediately as something neither wanted to disturb. Dinners no longer felt like negotiations. Hastings began arriving before she descended the stairs, rather than after, waiting at the bottom with an unhurried patience that hadn't existed in him during the early months of their marriage. Eleanor found herself seeking him out in the library, not because she expected him there, but because some part of her had simply begun to want his presence the way she'd once wanted, only solitude. It was a quiet evening, rain against the windows, that finally dissolved the last formality remaining between them. "I've been thinking," she said, curled into the chair across from his, "about the night you removed your gloves in this room. I think about it more often than I'd like to admit." His eyes lifted from his book, steady on hers. "It was the first time I let you see anything true. You've let me see a great deal of true things since." She set her own book aside. "The night of the ballroom. The night you told me you were terrified of losing me. I've been waiting, I think, to see if there was anything left you were still protecting." He set his book down slowly, understanding the shape of the question beneath her words before she finished asking it. "There's nothing left," he said quietly. "I gave you everything I had left to give the night I told you the truth about why I married you. Everything since has only been confirmation of it." Eleanor rose, crossing the small distance between their chairs, and this time it was she who reached for his hand, first turning it over, slowly unbuttoning the cuff at his wrist with deliberate care, an echo of every glove he'd ever removed for her, reversed. "I asked for separate rooms," she said softly, "because I didn't trust what intimacy would cost me in a marriage built on obligation. And now I don't think there's any obligation left to protect myself from." Her eyes lifted to his, steady, certain, only choice. He rose without releasing her hand, the careful distance he'd maintained even in his most unguarded moments finally, fully closing his free hand, rising to cradle her face with a tenderness that bore no resemblance to the cold, transactional man who'd proposed marriage in her father's threadbare drawing room a lifetime ago. Eleanor. Just her name, the way he always said it when nothing careful remained in him. "Tell me this is what you want, and not merely what tonight has made convenient to feel. I have spent months choosing you in small, deliberate ways you may not have noticed," she said, her hand covering his, where it rested against her cheek, "staying when I could have asked for an annulment myself, defending you to my own father, waiting in this library every evening for a man I told myself I was not waiting for." Her voice softened further. "This isn't convenience, Your Grace. This is the most deliberate choice I've made since the night you said we would marry by week's end." Whatever remained of his restraint finally surrendered entirely. He kissed her without the careful gentleness of the library confession weeks before, deeper now, certain, his hands finding her waist and drawing her fully against him as though the months of measured distance had simply been a debt finally come due. She felt him breathe her name against her mouth between kisses, felt the tremor in his hands as he gathered her closer. No calculation left in either of them, only the slow unraveling of two people who had spent a lifetime believing wanting something this much made you vulnerable to losing it. He lifted her into his arms, and she didn't protest, didn't measure the moment for what it cost. Either of their carefully built defenses only let herself be carried up the stairs toward a room that had never, not once, since the wedding night, been entered by them both together. Morning light found them tangled together in a stillness Eleanor hadn't known. Her own body could hold not the careful, measured stillness of restraint, but something looser, safer, entirely unguarded. Hastings lay watching her with an expression she'd never once seen from him in public. Soft, unhidden. The architecture of control he wore like a second skin, completely absent from his face. "You're staring," she murmured. "I find I'm allowed to now." His hand traced an idle line along her bare shoulder. "I spent a year promising you distance. I find I have very little appetite left for keeping that promise." She turned into him, her palm flattening against his chest, feeling the steady, unguarded rhythm of his heartbeat beneath it. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The contract, the terms, the year of distance before this?" "No." His arm tightened around her, certain. "I think I needed every one of those rules, Eleanor. Every boundary you set, every distance I maintained to understand exactly what it would cost me to break them. When I finally decided you were worth breaking every single one for." That evening, the library held them both again. The same room, the same candlelight, the same chairs where a man had once removed his gloves and told her a truth he'd spent his whole life avoiding. This time, he removed them before she'd even sat down, setting them on the table between them with none of the hesitation that had marked the first time. "I married you," he said quietly, watching the candlelight flicker across her face to end a scandal. That was true the night I said it in front of Pembroke and Caro, and I won't pretend otherwise now, even though it costs me something to admit how little romance existed in that decision. I know. Her hand found his across the table, fingers lacing through his bare ones without hesitation. I was there, but I stayed, he continued, voice low, unguarded, because somewhere in the month since, I ruined every rule I built to protect myself from exactly this. I told myself I wouldn't want you. I told myself distance was safety. I told myself control was the only inheritance worth protecting. His thumb traced slowly along her knuckles, reverent in a way that bore no resemblance to the cold, efficient man who'd first proposed this marriage. You dismantled every one of those rules without ever asking me to, Eleanor. You simply became something I was no longer willing to protect myself from. The candle between them burned low, steady, casting the same warm light it had the night everything between them first cracked open. Then I suppose, she said softly, we're both rather terrible at keeping rules we set for ourselves. His smile, when it came, held nothing guarded in it at all. I find, he said, drawing her hand to his lips, that I have never been more grateful for a single failure in my entire life. Outside, the estate settled into the quiet hush of evening, no scandal left to manage, no rival left undefeated, no rule left standing between them except the ones they now chose, deliberately, to keep for each other. 3 years had softened the estate in ways Eleanor hadn't expected, not the stone or the gardens, which remained as grand and grey as ever, but the rooms themselves, filled now with sounds that had no place in the careful, distant household she'd first married into. She found Hastings in the library, exactly where she'd known she would, a small figure, asleep against his chest, in the same chair where he'd once removed his gloves and confessed a truth that had cost him everything he believed himself to be. She fought sleep for an hour, he said quietly, not looking up from his daughter's dark hair, and lost rather spectacularly. She inherited that from you, refusing to surrender anything without a fight first. I'd say she inherited her stubbornness from her mother. His eyes lifted, warm in a way that still, after 3 years, occasionally caught her breath. Though I confess, I haven't entirely decided which of us to blame for it. Eleanor crossed the room and settled into the chair across from him, the same chair, the same candlelight, the same quiet that had once held so much restrained longing between them and now simply held peace. Lord Carrington's invitation arrived this morning, she said, for the autumn ball. Apparently, we're to be seated at the head table this year, a considerable improvement from the year half the room avoided meeting my eyes. He shifted carefully, easing their sleeping daughter into a more comfortable position against his shoulder. I believe society has decided to forgive me for my honesty, now that enough time has passed to make it fashionable rather than scandalous. And Ashworth, his expression didn't darken the way it once would have, at the name only settled into something distant, resolved. Stripped of his title's influence in the Lords, after the fraud was fully proven. Last I heard, he'd retreated to the continent, where I imagine he's found considerably fewer secretaries willing to forge letters on his behalf. No more shadows, then. No more shadows. His hand found hers across the small space between their chairs, the same gesture he'd offered 100 times since that first library confession, still carrying the same weight it always had. Only this, Eleanor watched the candlelight flicker across the face of the man who had once told her, plainly, that he'd married her to end a scandal, and who had spent every year since proving, in small and enormous ways, exactly how thoroughly he'd meant the rest of what he'd promised her that night. Their daughter stirred faintly against his shoulder, one small hand curling into the fabric of his coat, and Hastings's expression unguarded, unhidden, entirely undefended. was the same one Eleanor had first glimpsed the night he removed his gloves and let her see him completely. 3 years, she said softly, and you still look at her the way you looked at me that first night? I imagine I always will. His thumb traced slow, absent circles against her knuckles, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. I spent so long believing love made a man vulnerable to losing everything he valued. His eyes lifted to hers, steady, certain, entirely at peace with the answer he'd found. I find instead that it's the only thing I've ever held that was worth the risk of losing it all. Outside the library window, the estate settled into evening, no scandal waiting in the wings, no rival left to threaten what they'd built, only the quiet, ordinary permanence of a family that had survived its own beginning and chosen, deliberately, every day since, to stay. Thank you for watching. If you loved Hastings and Eleanor's story, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next romance.